My name is Agnes M. Parker, and this is my confession. The late afternoon sun was thin and yellow through the lace curtain the day I opened the leather journal that had been hidden in the attic of the convent for decades. I ran my fingers over its spine and felt the ridges of the thread and leather like the ridges of a scar. I could smell dust and lemon polish and the faint perfume of incense that never seems to leave a place like that. Today I am 74 years old, and it has taken every year, every tremor, and every small victory to be able to tell this story out loud. I am not telling it to condemn faith. I am telling it because the thing that harmed me and others wore the robes of piety and spoke the words of prayer while it built cages of silence. Sit with me for a while. If this touches you, leave a word in the comments. Truth expands when it is shared, and sometimes a single comment is the bridge someone needs to step out of a dark room. I will tell you how I came to be called Sister Agnes, how a promise of sanctuary became a place of punishment, and how a buried diary became the seed of a movement that changed a town and offered a home to those the institution had left behind. I have letters, a medical report, and the diary that names dates and punishments. I have witnesses who still tremble when they speak the names of those who hurt us. Everything I say is anchored in documents and people who will stand with me. Now I go back to the beginning to show you how the ordinary threads of a small life were pulled so tightly that they snapped. I was born in a kitchen that smelled like yeast and old newspapers and the coal stove my mother kept alight all winter. My father worked on the docks and came home with the smell of salt, oil, and tobacco. My mother, Miriam, hummed hymns while she kneaded dough, not out of piety alone, but because the rhythm steadied her hands and quieted the nights when there was no work. We lived in a modest row house with a garden that produced enough tomatoes to can through the summer. I was the eldest of 3 daughters, and I learned early that being useful often meant being invisible. By the time I was 12, I could make bread, mend a shirt, and keep my sister Lucy from burning her fingers. At 14, I worked at the dressmaker where the machines whirred like the heart of some large animal. School was a luxury we could not afford, and church was both a community and a rule book. I learned prayers as I learned how to fold shirts and how to speak when spoken to. The first adult who told me I had a calling was Father Thomas, a man with soft eyes who smelled of musk and dust, and who told my mother that perhaps Agnes had a vocation to become a nun. I did not yet have language to separate the warmth of being wanted from the cold of being chosen. At 19, after a winter of coughing fits and a summer of quiet decisions, I agreed to go with a small band of girls to what was described to my family as a place of training and devotion. They called it a novitiate, and we called it a place that would keep us safe and teach us to be better. In truth, I left because the promise of a steady bed and 2 meals a day felt like a rescue. I did not know then that sometimes rescue tastes like vinegar and iron and is served with a smile. The day they sent me to the convent, the air smelled like rain and petrol because my brother had driven us and had to fill the car before the long trip. I remember the gravel crunching under the wheels and the bell tower of the monastery like a watchful tooth against the sky. There was a woman at the gate with an envelope and a look that suggested I could go in but not out. Her name was Sister Margaret. She touched my coat and said welcome in a voice that tried to be both kind and official. The first weeks were schedules and chores and a calendar that ruled the day. We rose before dawn to the sound of a bell, and the cold stone floor was always damp under our feet. Our hands learned rituals of folding, polishing, and silence. At night, the corridor was a thin strip of shadow, and the smell of boiled cabbage drifted from the refectory. I kept a small notebook in secret where I wrote the names of the women I came to know and the small details that kept me human, like the scar on Sister June's knuckle and the way Sister Claire laughed with her mouth closed. There were older women who had been there longer and younger ones who arrived with the same blank hope that I had carried. The superior of the house was Mother Eleanor, a woman whose habit was always immaculate and whose eyes were quick and appraising. It was Mother Eleanor who kept the ledger and who signed the note when girls were admitted or sent away. At first, everything seemed strict but bearable. Rules were rules and punishment was whispered as correction. Then the tone shifted and small cruelties bled into larger ones. The incident that forced the seam of my life open began with a single night when Sister Margaret did not come to matins. Instead, a note was passed, the handwriting small and clipped. She had been taken to an infirmary, the note said, but the word used had a weight like accusation. That very week, a 17-year-old named Rosa had her mother come to visit, and the visit was stopped by a locked door and the clack of keys. The first time I realized that the institution could be unjust was when I found a folded photograph in the laundry room. It was of Rosa, standing by a wall with a bruise on her temple, and someone had written on the back, "Keep quiet." The photograph smelled faintly of soap and something metallic. I kept the photograph hidden and began to watch patterns. I listened to the way men from the outside came and spoke with Mother Eleanor in the private parlor. I noticed how some of the older nuns had eyes like windows half closed. One night, I heard a conversation in the upstairs parlor between Mother Eleanor and a visiting man named Dr. Barnaby, who worked with the diocese on certain medical matters. They spoke low, and the words clipped like shears. Their voices were the taste of a sour plum. He said in that thin voice that the girls needed to be taught about obedience and that silence was necessary for the good of the house. She agreed, and the word she used for obedience had a meaning that left a metallic taste in my mouth. Soon after, some young girls were given more duties and less food. Some were locked in a small room they called the cell for the night. One of the sisters, Sister Claire, tried to complain and was told to confess. Confession had always been private and sacred. Suddenly, it was a tool for control. When I tried to speak to Sister June, she placed a hand over mine with a rustle of habit and whispered that some things could not be named. My heart felt like a stone. I will not recreate every cruel hour because cruelty wears thin and then it dulls. But I will tell you the night I decided that silence would no longer be my companion. It was a late autumn night when the wind pressed like a cold hand against the shutters and I smelled wet earth and candle wax. Rosa was missing from the dormitory, and later I found the photograph tucked into the pages of the superior's ledger with a note that read, "Corrected." The word was small and final. I confronted Sister Margaret in the laundry room where the steam and soap made the tiles shine. She turned and looked at me and then at the photograph, and her face crumpled a little. Our conversation had more than 6 exchanges, and each one pushed at the boundary between fear and necessity. I said, "Why?" and she said, "You do not understand." I said, "I am afraid," and she said, "I know." I said, "We cannot keep doing this," and she said, "Who will listen?" And I said, "We will speak," and she said, "You cannot." I said, "We have to prove it," and she said, "Prove what?" And I said, "Everything." She gripped the photograph as if it were both a confession and a grave. The laundry room smelled of starch, and the iron hummed like distant thunder. That was the moment a plan began to shape itself in the quiet parts of my mind. The plan was neither dramatic nor cinematic. It was patient and full of small, careful movements. We were a group of 7 who watched quietly and kept notes. I will name them because names make the invisible visible. Sister June, a small woman with steady hands who knew how to stitch secrets into seams. Sister Claire, who kept the ledger of food and had memorized times and visitors. Rosa, whose bruise had been a turning point. Maria, who had a cousin in the town council and could carry messages. Father Lucas, a priest who had once counseled Mother Eleanor and had begun to doubt the house's methods. And Esther, an ex-lay worker who still cleaned the chapel and could move in and out with fewer questions. We met in the storeroom beneath a stack of quilts where the air smelled like wool and lemon and mothballs. We used whispers and notes and a diary page as our map. We needed proof. The diary of the superior would be the most damning document, but it was locked in her desk in the parlor. We had to find a way to see it and copy the entries without being seen. Preparing the plan involved 6 to 8 exchanges over several nights, where we listed times and contingencies, who would distract, who would keep watch, and who would copy. Each exchange was short and sharp like stitches being placed. The first tension was the fear of being caught. The second was the moral weight of betraying vows of silence. The third was the knowledge that if we failed, the consequences would be worse than before. We practiced in whispers and checked pockets and used the smell of lemon polish as a signal. On the night we moved, we wrapped the diary in oilcloth and carried it out in the basket of laundry that Esther took to the back door. The night air smelled of cold metal and bread baking at a neighbor's house, and the stars above the convent were distant and indifferent. We did not flee the convent that night. We fled the tyranny inside it. We handed copies of the diary to Father Lucas and to Maria's cousin on the council. The diary had entries dated over 10 years and contained shorthand about corrections and lists of girls considered unruly. It mentioned specific punishments and named at least 3 outside men who visited with regularity to discuss matters that should have been private. There were phrases that read like codes: quieting measures, special obedience, corrective solitude. When the council member read the entries, he hid them in his briefcase like contraband. Within a week, a group of local journalists received redacted notes, and then the first article appeared in the town paper. People read the article at breakfast counters and in laundromats. There was a shock like cold water poured over the town's complacency. Some responded with anger, others with disbelief. That was when the first CTA to viewers in my story would be placed if this were a screen piece. If you are listening and your chest tightens, breathe. Leave a single word in the comments to tell someone you are there. Many of those who read the articles wrote letters, but some of those letters were intercepted. The convent sealed its gates and denied everything with the same polished sentences it had always used. Mother Eleanor gave interviews that were measured and pious. She spoke about tradition and protection and the sanctity of the house. But the diary lived in the hands of people who did not fear the consequences of publication. After the initial exposé, there were threats. Mother Eleanor claimed the diary was forged and that the girls had been coached. Some parishioners stood by the convent and demanded that the girls be punished for bringing shame upon the community. Others began to gather in small groups in the square with candles and banners that read, "Listening for Justice." A small commission was formed by the council to investigate, and they called for formal statements. I remember the taste of metal in my mouth when I signed my first affidavit. The legal process is cold and technical, and I will describe some of those procedures because they matter. The complaint was filed with the county clerk with an attached affidavit and a list of witnesses. We requested an inspection and asked for a forensic interview to be conducted according to protocol. The forensic interview protocol required a neutral specialist to ask open-ended questions and to avoid leading phrases so that the testimony would stand in court. We also sought a preservation order to keep the convent from altering records. The filing was accompanied by emails, photographic evidence, and the copies of the diary. The clerk stamped the papers and the first hearing was scheduled. The procedural steps felt like a ritual of their own, but they were the scaffolding of accountability. The technical description of filing and protocol is a small string of words and signatures that nevertheless can dismantle a wall of silence if executed precisely and with counsel. The institution did not yield easily. Mother Eleanor hired a lawyer who argued that the convent was a private entity and that the matters within were ecclesiastical and therefore outside the purview of civilian courts. He used reverent language and a smooth voice. They produced a counter-archive that included glowing letters from parents and a file of medical notes that suggested obedience trainings had medical supervision. In response, our group produced witness statements, the diary copies, and a medical report from Dr. Alvarez, a physician who had examined several girls after they had left the convent and found patterns of bruising consistent with repeated physical constraint. The medical report was worded clinically, and the language of forensics was deliberate. At the first hearing, the judge asked for an independent inspection. That inspection would change everything. Inspectors arrived, and the air felt twice as heavy as before. They opened cupboards and read ledgers, and a metal filing cabinet in the superior's office gave up envelopes with names that matched the diary. The inspector's report was 3,200 words long and included photographs and a recommendation for further criminal inquiry. I will summarize a technical step here because it was vital. The chain of custody for those photographs and documents was established through a signed log that tracked each item from the convent to the commission offices. Signing that log felt like signing a promise that we would not give up. The legal machinery can appear slow and sterile, but when combined with human persistence, it makes the invisible visible. There were moments of acute tension that I will describe because they shaped the contours of our courage. The first moment was the night we found the photograph of Rosa and the ledger note that marked her as corrected. In that moment, my pulse ran like rain on a tin roof, and I felt the weight of the choice to speak. Memory flooded my chest, and I saw my mother's hands folding and the quiet of the kitchen. I chose to copy the entry and hide the photograph. The second moment came when an official from the diocese came to the house and demanded to know who had leaked the diary. The visitor's suit smelled of cologne, and the words he used felt like a legal net. My hands shook in the refectory as he asked questions, and I chose to stare at my bowl of thin soup instead of meeting his eyes. The third moment was in the courtroom when a witness broke down and named a man who had been allowed into the private parlor under the guise of offering spiritual counsel. The courtroom smelled of old wood and the heat of lights, and my mouth was dry as old bread. The judge raised his eyebrows and asked for clarity. The witness spoke, and the courtroom was still. Each of these moments involved a memory, a conflict of conscience, and then a decision to act. That pattern repeated until the case outgrew the town and reached national attention. Dialogues were a lifeline in those days. In one important scene, I confronted Father Lucas in the vestry, and we had 6 exchanges that changed both of us. I said, "Father Lucas, we need you." And he said, "I'm scared." I said, "Scared for whom?" And he said, "For the church." I said, "The church is supposed to shelter the vulnerable." And he said, "Words can be used as weapons." I said, "Can you not see them being used that way here?" And he said, "I have counseled Mother Eleanor, and she shows no sign of remorse." I said, "Then you must choose." And he said, "What if choosing destroys what we believe in?" I said, "What we believe in is not cages." And he said, "Then show me how to do it." In that exchange, the vestry was quiet and smelled of wax, and the light slanted through the stained glass and cut his hands in jewel-colored shapes. He agreed to testify, and the power of his statement helped crack the shell of denial in the institution. In another scene, the group of us argued softly in the storeroom about whether to go public with the diary. Rosa said, "If we do this, they will punish me." And I said, "Better punished than erased." Maria said her cousin could protect us, and Esther said she had a friend in a bakery who could copy the papers. The exchanges were practical, and fear laced each sentence like a spice that warmed and warned. Those conversations met the requirement we had given ourselves to have at least 6 to 8 exchanges in critical moments, and they filled the small rooms with the air of plotting and prayer. As the case grew, more names came forward. I will name several people because names are the smallest acts of justice I can give. Mother Eleanor, the superior, Sister Margaret, the laundry coordinator, who sometimes helped and sometimes hid, Sister June, my ally with steady hands, Sister Claire, the ledger keeper, Father Lucas, who became a reluctant witness, Dr. Barnaby, the visiting physician, who denied wrongdoing and defended obedience, Dr. Alvarez, the independent physician who testified to physical injuries, Rosa, the youngest of our group, whose bruise started the chain, Maria, who connected the group to civic help, Esther, the quiet keeper of doors, and Mr. Harlan, the council member who filed the initial inspection request. Each of these people acted in specific ways that moved the narrative forward. Some aided us openly, some helped in secret, some resisted us and were later confronted by their choices. None of them were mere figures. They had small rituals and scents and phrases that made them human and flawed. The months that followed were a procession of evidence gathering, interviews, and committee meetings. Journalists arrived with notebooks and cameras, and sometimes with compassion that surprised us. We held a small press conference in the square, and the sound of the townspeople whispering our names felt both terrifying and liberating. The convent brought counter-witnesses, and the press framed the story in ways that sometimes hurt more than helped. There were threats mailed to my small house address, and someone smashed the window of the bakery where Esther worked. My heart, which had felt steadier after the inspection, beat with new fears. There were also moments of compassion. A teacher named Helen, who taught in a nearby school, organized clothing drives for the girls who had left with nothing. A lawyer named Rachel offered to take our case pro bono, and she brought with her a team who knew how to navigate the technicalities of ecclesiastical claims and civil jurisdiction. The combination of local outrage, competent legal strategy, and media pressure forced the diocese to agree to an independent commission. That commission subpoenaed records and called witnesses, and the archives it opened held a pattern that was undeniable. We had to learn to testify without being consumed. The first public hearing was long and ritualistic. We sat in a row and answered questions using the neutral voice we had practiced with Rachel. When I spoke, I described the days and the smells and the ledger notes and the diary entries. I used specific details because details make things real and cannot be brushed aside as rumor. In court, certain phrases were used, like preponderance of evidence and jurisdictional limits, that made my stomach knot. The prosecutor explained how the chain of custody maintained our evidence and how forensic interviews conducted by professionals ensured the testimony would be less vulnerable to critique. The technical descriptions I give are only to show that justice is often procedural and paperwork heavy and needs patient people who know how to do the forms correctly. The opposing counsel tried to poke holes and sometimes succeeded in raising doubts in the minds of listeners who were not trained to sift emotional testimony from facts. It was exhausting, but the process taught us the value of persistence. Outside of court, life began to reweave itself. We transformed a small house near the edge of town into what we called Hope House, a place where women and girls who had left the convent could find food, work training, and shelter. The house smelled of coffee and detergent and the sound of conversation that did not begin and end with prayer. We trained volunteers and created a simple intake form and rules that prioritized safety and choice. Hope House was not a perfect solution. It could not undo years of silence, but it offered a place to sleep and a place to speak without fear. We also organized community meetings and workshops about consent and rights and how to report abuse. The workshops had a small, tangible success when a local clinic agreed to adopt a new protocol for documenting injuries and providing referrals to legal aid. The rebuilding phase was slow and careful, but it was real. In that phase, we found allies in unexpected places, like the school teacher Helen and a retired nurse named Joan, who provided first aid training and the warmth of a steady presence. There were 5 core moments of tension that shaped the movement, and each lasted over several weeks. The first was the initial publication that forced us out of private struggle into public scrutiny. That moment was full of shock and fear and the decision to continue. The second was the legal argument about jurisdiction between civil courts and church courts, which threatened to close the case forever. The third was the public hearing, where we had to articulate our pain in front of cameras and legal professionals. The fourth was the direct confrontation with Mother Eleanor in a mediation room, where she refused to accept responsibility. The fifth was the verdict-like moment when the commission recommended restitution and structural changes to how the institution handled complaints. Each of these tensions required 3 parts. First, the internal conflict of whether to continue, then the memory of what we had endured to motivate action, and then the decision to push forward despite the risk. I will not hide how heavy those decisions were. We lost friends, we were shouted at in the square, but we also gained a network that eventually became a defense for others. The activism that emerged from our story took forms we did not initially imagine. We built a volunteer network that worked with social services and legal aid. We created a small archive of documents that could be accessed by researchers and journalists, and we lobbied the council to pass an ordinance requiring religious institutions that received public funds to submit to independent oversight for complaints of abuse. That ordinance was hard-won. It required drafting legal language in public hearings and overcoming arguments about religious freedom. We met with council members and explained the human cost of inaction. In time, the council voted to require transparency for institutions receiving municipal grants and to create a small oversight committee that included lay members trained in safeguarding. This was not a law of national scope, but it changed how business was done locally and gave other towns a model to copy. The diaries and photographs in the inspector's report were lodged with a regional archive for further study and public access. I want to be clear about a few technical procedures that mattered in the campaign because they are often the difference between a file gathering dust and an inquiry opening a door. First, the forensic interview protocol used an open question technique with recording and transcribed notes. The interviews were conducted in a child-sensitive room when minors were involved and in full compliance with legal standards to protect the witness's identity when necessary. Second, the chain of custody for documents required signatures in sealed envelopes and a log entry every time an item changed hands. Third, the preservation order meant the convent could not destroy records while the inquiry was ongoing. Each of these steps required people who were willing to learn the language of law and to be precise in their actions. These technical details are small but essential. One of the hardest parts was watching people we loved choose to remain silent and even defend the institution. A few sisters publicly supported Mother Eleanor and wrote letters to the editor. Some parishioners marched with banners calling us traitors. It was painful. And yet other former residents came forward years later, saying they had been waiting to see whether anyone would hold the house to account. Their voices changed things. A former novitiate named Hannah found courage and testified that decades earlier, she had been punished for leaving a window open and for having a letter from a boyfriend. Her account showed patterns of petty cruelties that allowed larger abuses to grow unnoticed. When she spoke, she described the smell of damp robes and the sound of keys being placed on a table like final verdicts. Her testimony moved people. It helped the commission recommend that complaints from institutional contexts be routed through a civilian oversight body and not solely internal processes. We also created a set of programs to prevent recurrence. Hope House offered legal clinics where lawyers like Rachel and other volunteers gave pro bono advice. We organized training sessions for local clergy about safeguarding and consent, and ran a simple hotline where people could call without naming names. We documented a diary and photographs and donated copies to a regional human rights organization to assist in systemic research. Slowly, public attitudes shifted. People who had been silent began to speak. A paper mill closed its relationship to the convent and redirected funds to survivor services. These are small policy wins, but they added up. There were legal outcomes that were both partial and meaningful. The commission recommended disciplinary actions against those named and suggested that the diocese implement independent safeguarding measures, including a mandatory reporting system and an independent review board. A pretrial agreement was reached that included compensation for several survivors and a commitment to fund rehabilitation programs. The compensation did not erase pain, but it was a formal acknowledgement of harm, and it funded Hope House in its early years. The legal description here is that civil settlement was used to avoid a full criminal trial for certain named individuals, while administrative consequences within the church were recommended by the commission. That balance left some wounds unclosed, but created structures to protect future generations. Time moved forward, and we reached a kind of uneasy peace. Hope House grew into a registered charity and offered shelter and education to dozens of women in its first year. We documented the story in a local newspaper series and then in a regional magazine that brought more attention and funding. We testified at a legislative hearing that considered statewide guidelines for institutional oversight. Our small-town model was cited as a case study. None of this was inevitable. It happened because people risked reputation, comfort, and sometimes safety to keep telling the truth. An epilogue is necessary because the aftermath is where the work either solidifies or drifts. 1 month after the commission's report, the town opened a listening center where trained volunteers answered calls and provided referrals. The listening center had a small office smelling of coffee and printer toner, and it operated 20 hours a week. It handled over 100 calls in the first month and made direct referrals to legal aid and emergency shelters. 3 months later, Hope House had formally registered as a nonprofit, acquired a small grant, and hired 2 staff members to run counseling and job training. Attendance at the training program grew, and women who had been isolated found paid work at local shops that had agreed to participate in a placement program. The first tangible, quantifiable measure was that 38% of those who came to Hope House in that initial 3-month period found either temporary employment or further education opportunities. 6 months from the commission, the council adopted new oversight guidelines requiring institutions receiving public funds to present an annual safeguarding audit. The law did not dismantle faith, but it required transparency and created a civilian avenue for complaints. Hope House supported 25 women in permanent housing in that first half year, and the hotline had logged over 300 calls since inception. These numbers are not just statistics, they are beds, warm meals, and the sound of someone sleeping without fear for the first time in months. They are the small, concrete impacts that show the movement had momentum. There were costs. Several of us lost friendships, and some of the sisters who sided with Mother Eleanor left the order entirely. The man, Dr. Barnaby, who had been implicated, died before any formal proceeding, and that left unresolved questions for many. Some parishioners never forgave us, and a few wrote vitriolic letters. But over time, the narrative shifted from shame to accountability. The archive we created was used by researchers who published articles about institutional power and mechanisms of silence. Some of those papers informed training programs in other towns. In private moments, I still wake with the sharp taste of fear that belonged to the earliest years. But I also wake with the memory of community breakfasts at Hope House and the sound of children playing in the yard where we planted a small olive tree as a symbol of ongoing care. I cannot claim heroism. I was a woman who loved prayer and who learned that love cannot be used as a tool to silence others. The truth I carry is not a simple absolution. It is messy and it requires ongoing work. If you are listening and your heart pounds at this, know that you are not alone. Leave a single word in the comments to say you are here. Subscribe if you want to follow the work that grew from this story and to learn practical steps about how to support survivors and how to navigate reporting channels and legal resources. Your subscription helps sustain stories that need telling and supports the networks that keep people safe. When I look back years from now, I will remember the day I opened the leather diary in the attic and the smell of dust and lemon polish. I will remember the ledger, with its small, cold notes, and the way names that had been erased were recovered by ink and memory. I will remember the women who taught me courage and the allies who learned to listen. The convent did not become perfect. Institutions do not change overnight. But we changed the arc of how complaints were handled in our town, and we created a refuge that did not exist before. The wounds remain, but they are no longer secret. The final thing I want to leave you with is simple. The truth finds its course like a river. It may be blocked and dammed, but water always seeks the sea. I am Agnes M. Parker, and this was my confession of survival and hope. Thank you for sitting with me.